All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the final session of day 3 of TMF Week 2023. I'm going to be your host today, Molly Sacker. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everyone could hear me. So if you could drop a message in the chat or leave a reaction and just let me know that everything's working and you can see my screen well. Okay. Seems like people can see me, so we'll continue on. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping rules. So all sessions will be recorded and available at the end of the day. You'll have full access to the recordings. You can watch them later whenever you'd like. All attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for the entire TMF Week conference. It's not going to be for the individual sessions. It's just going to be at the end of the conference. We'll send you a nice little certificate for all of the sessions. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. So throughout, if you want to pop your questions in the Q&A section in the right panel there, Jamie will be happy to answer them at the end. And finally, there is networking to follow. You can go and join your peers in the lounge or our virtual booth area and kind of keep the conversation going, keep learning, keep meeting people. So yeah, that will be available. Quick overview of the session. So the presentation is going to be around 30 minutes in length. And then afterwards, we'll have a Q&A period of about 15 minutes, sorry. And then after that, I'm going to give you a little overview of what's happening tomorrow, and then you are free to go and network and do whatever you'd like. So this is Jamie O'Keefe here on the line, and he's going to be sharing his presentation, Accelerate the Implementation of eTMF Systems with Risk-Based Validation. And with that, I will pass the baton over to you, Jamie, if you want to share your slides.
Great.
And there you go.
All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining today and making it through to the final session. Just a little bit about me. My name is Jamie O'Keefe, and I head up the Clinical and Regulatory Consulting Services practice at Asterix. I have a whole lot of experience in life sciences, business and technology consulting, and a pretty heavy focus in the past 15 years or so on clinical consulting overall, but particularly on the eTMF space. I've led eTMF programs as a consultant, anywhere from big top 5 pharma companies down to very small biotechs, going back in the old days to local install of software, which will come up a little bit in this presentation, and then of course more recently using cloud-based SaaS solutions. I've also been a member of the TMF reference model organization for well over a decade, and I'm happy to see them moving over to CDISC. So that's who I am. So today we're going to talk about what is usually not all of that interesting of a topic, but we're going to try and make it fun. Validation of eTMF systems, and how can we make validation more streamlined and more efficient given kind of the progress that's been made from a health authority standpoint, from a guidelines, but also with the evolution of technology and moving from custom application development and local install solutions to SaaS-based systems where the features and functions are common across all sponsors. So we'll start with, kind of a high-level overview of what is validation, talk a little bit about how it's historically or maybe currently been done, a little overview on kind of definitions of verification versus validation versus testing, and then really get into, why are we doing it this way now when it's somewhat onerous, and what can we do looking at software quality assurance, kind of emerging guidance that's coming out of the FDA to significantly optimize this generally, but then I'll kind of talk in the voiceovers on how this impacts eTMF specifically. And happy to take questions as we go through. I don't really like staring at a screen and not talking to people. So if you have questions as we go along, we can definitely address those as we go. So starting off, what is validation and why do we do it? So we do it because the health authorities tell us we have to. But the FDA's definition of software validation from the Guidance for Industry for Computerized Systems in Clinical Trials is confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence that the software conforms to the user's needs and the intended usage. So it's intended to just show the system does what the user wants it to do, right? And then within that, you have to document it appropriately to ensure that you have, just like anything else in your eTMF, appropriate documentation of what you've done. So the historical approach to validation, and a lot of this has gotten a little bit more streamlined over the years, but most of the projects I've done over the past 20 years, validation becomes lots and lots and lots of testing, documentation, time, money, and most often pain, right? So it is the least desired part of a systems implementation project. And what's even worse is that once a system goes live, the desire to not go back into validation causes companies to not want to make changes to their systems. So this is what we're trying to attack and make changes on as we move forward. And honestly, this is very much the reason for CSA and the goals of CSA by the FDA. So another thing to take into account is, right, the industry has kind of confused and made has kind of made testing of a system to be the same as validation of a system, and that's it's pretty unfair, and it's caused a lot of the confusion and a lot of the pain in moving forward with validating regulated systems, right? So verification, this is something that should be done regardless of whether it's a regulated system or not, right? Like the purpose of verification or testing, so to speak, is it's to determine if the software is designed and developed per the requirements. So you've got business requirements, functional requirements, maybe technical requirements, right? Like, so that's going through and saying, does the system do what the documents say the system's supposed to do? Qualification then verifies that a piece of the system can do what it's supposed to do, kind of as a subunit. Validation is where it gets interesting, right? Like the actual intent of validation is to ensure that the process can work using all of the pieces of it. So people, process, and technology. So its intent is to go, can you do your day-to-day job with all of the tools that you have in place? Not, I'm gonna make sure that if I click on this link, it goes to this page and gives me these 5 fields to fill out, right? Like the intent of it is, can I submit an issue and report on it, as I'm doing a site monitoring visit report kind of a thing. So if you think about those things separately, it starts to become easier to tease out where validation has become painful when you've pushed verification and qualification all into the validation process. So why did we do it that way? So there's a bunch of different reasons why we kind of got conservative and went a little bit wild with the amount of testing and therefore validation that was being done, right? It became something in people's heads that there needed to be 100% traceability between system requirements and test verification and validation. So everybody knows trace matrices, right? So we moved making sure that the system did its job, so verification, into the validation step. So it just literally becomes a step-by-step, field-by-field, does the thing do what we're supposed to do? The problem with that is you often can't see the forest for the trees, right? There's so much focus on does each individual requirement, is that met? There's rarely these days a verification or a validation done to go, does this actually support the business process? And does this actually let the business do what they need to do on a day-to-day basis? So it may technically be verified and do what the document says, but it still doesn't support the business process. Another big reason that it was done this way was 15, 20 years ago, the vast majority of products or systems that were put in place, particularly in R&D and in clinical, were custom application development. or they were heavily customized COTS products. So in the case of eTMF, you look back 15, 20 years, Documentum was heavily in play if people had document repositories for clinical documentation, and it was usually heavily customized to meet the need of life sciences and clinical. So custom configurations, you might have custom development built so that you could do certain reports, things like that. So when you have custom application development, you need to test to make sure the system works, and you need to validate to make sure that it does what the business wants to do from a process standpoint. A lot of the reason that there was customization and custom application development is for a long time, pharma and even more particularly in clinical and R&D had a very strong mentality of we're different, right? Everybody does everything differently. We can't possibly use an off-the-shelf product that other sponsors use because we do our studies differently. So that again reinforced we're going to heavily customize or configure a system to do it exactly the way our business works today. Another reason that validation tended to get overburdened, to be honest, business teams got burned by bad implementations for IT projects. So they got a lot of systems that didn't actually get verified appropriately. So their only choice was to force a higher level of testing into the validation step. So they won't sign off on the validation and say the system works until they see all of these test scripts are run and passed appropriately. And then the final reason, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone on this call, right? Clinical and R&D and pharma companies are historically been a very risk-averse culture. So make sure that everything works, make sure we've got all the documentation appropriately, right? Patient safety is primary, so we're not going to take a risk and kind of cut corners from a documentation or testing perspective. So why does this model suck? It really does. So there's a bunch of different reasons why this model sucks. The first, as I talked about earlier, is it doesn't actually meet the outcome desired. So I've implemented hundreds of systems over the course of 20 plus years in life sciences and R&D in particular. The vast majority of them are regulated systems. And very rarely, I'd say less than 10% of the time, did the business actually do a business process verification and validation that the system did what they needed to do to support their day-to-day business. Either from literally just following a business process through to the system capabilities to the final output that's needed, or even just hey, I'm just going to walk into the system and see if I can do what I need to do within it. They spent all of this time, and they had consultants and IT people spend all this time doing the point-to-point requirement verification and testing, but they never took the time to look at this and go, so did what I tell them to do from a requirement standpoint actually do what I needed it to do from a business standpoint and within the business process that either exists today or that we've redefined as part of this program. Second reason this sucks is it's really expensive, right? It takes a lot of manpower, a lot of time, and a lot of effort to do all of this testing, to do every time there's a small defect, be it a script defect or any kind of a defect, to go back and recycle and update test scripts and then rerun the test scripts and then get them pre-approved and post-approved and all of that kind of work. It's a significant part of timelines and cost of projects. And it doesn't really focus on the risks, right? It doesn't take into account, historically, it's not taken into account, does this system have a significant impact on patient safety? Is a given set of processes or features within the system even relevant to the business process? And in the era of software as a service, right, the Vivas of the world, the Montrons of the world, things like that, it significantly duplicates the effort of testing and validation and verification that's already come before it, right? All of these vendors have robust, well-established testing and validation and verification programs that they do on their base platforms. When you go and retest every single feature, whether or not you've made a configuration change to it or customized it, you're basically throwing that all out the window. All of that effort and all of that time spent, likely done better from a testing standpoint, because that's their job and that's what they know well. And you're just redoing that work. It also, as I talked about earlier, significantly inhibits continuous improvement of both business process and the system. Because once a system goes live and you've gone through all this pain, nobody wants to touch it again, right? It's too expensive to update the system. So either you delay feature changes or bug fixes until you have enough to kind of deal with the fact that it's going to be a 6-week or a 3-month validation process, or you just never fix them, and the business comes up with business workarounds to flawed systems implementations or bugs or just evolutions in the business operating model. And as I said throughout, it significantly increases the overall project implementation timelines. Anywhere from 20 to 30% calendar-wise of a systems implementation project typically encompasses the testing through final validation and acceptance. So now I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. So this was a real project. It was a client I had within the past 2 years or so, right? They're a small biotech company implementing a SaaS-based eTMF system. The purpose of them putting the system into place was literally to just transfer eTMFs that CROs had been managing for long-term archives. So all the studies were closing out, they were being handed over to the sponsor. It was just, we want to have a final resting place and be able to maintain our trial master file content moving forward. They did absolutely no configuration or customization of the system. They took the system features exactly as out of the box by the vendor. No changes to security or anything. It was however it was done, straight out of the box when it was installed. That's how they took it. They did a full vendor audit on this product vendor and did a review of the SDLC, the SOPs for managing testing and product development and all of these things. And their quality department, certified that they had good processes and they had a good system development lifecycle. As we get into final implementation, and we're prepping to get our SOPs implemented and ready to go live with the system, the quality organization came back in and made the decision that we needed to do full verification and validation of all of the features in the system, whether or not that had been done by the SaaS vendor already and whether or not there was any configuration changes done. So they went back and we had to have full test script traceability to every requirement that existed. And overall, this took a project that was going to be a nice 6-week implementation project. It extended out to 10 weeks, so almost over 50% more than the original timeline. And it actually ended up adding 30% to the budget of the project. All of this to, in my opinion, not really change the outcome of the project or the risk factor to the sponsor. Not surprisingly, none of the scripts failed. Everything worked as appropriately, and we effectively just lost 4 weeks and not a small amount of money from a budget standpoint. So how do we fix this? Well, fortunately, the FDA has come to the rescue on this one and has put out guidance and a draft on something called computer systems assurance. So recognizing that a significant amount of time is being spent on documentation and testing and verification without a whole lot of value, the FDA has come forward with an approach to take a risk-based approach to understand whether or not software is fit for its intended use. So the goal of this is to consider the risks of compromised safety or quality of the device or system, and then determine based off of the level of risk what kind of testing and level of testing is appropriate to ensure that you have confidence that the software is going to do what it's supposed to do. And the intent and the philosophy behind all of this is the goal is to take the least burdensome documentation approach. and do only what's necessary to address whatever risk may or may not have been identified by this system. And the goal here is focus on product quality, focus on product risk, and use the resources in those areas of high value, not in low value resources. So this all sounds great. So how do we go about doing these things? So there's kind of two sections to this. First, the guiding principles that they have of how do you determine risk of a system or software product. It starts off with, does it impact patient safety? Does it impact product quality if it happens to be part of a medical device or something like that? Or literal manufacturing product quality? And does it affect system or data integrity? So if you think about it, if you start to walk down those three questions, a whole lot of systems get dropped off the list, right, from a risk standpoint. Second part is they've outlined a methodology that has 4 phases that I'll go through, right? So first is to identify and document and define the intended use of the system. So what is it being used for? Where in the life cycle is it? Second, you do a risk assessment, right? Like, this is great. So health authorities and overall quality by design principles have been coming in. ICH E6R2, right? So we're now taking that over to computer systems validation. So you do a risk assessment of the software, determine the level of risk associated with what's the risk that the system isn't going to do what we intended to do. Based off of that risk assessment, you build out your assurance approach. So how much testing, what kind of testing, how are we going to document it? And then you build out the appropriate records so that we have documentation to demonstrate what did we do, how did we do it, why did we do it, and what the logic was for doing it that way. So starting with identifying the intended use. A big thing that was outlined as part of SQA in this was the notion of it being a direct system or an indirect system. So a direct system is defined as directly being involved in the health and safety of a product or pharmaceutical. Indirect, it doesn't directly impact the product or patient safety, but it may impact the overall quality system. So document control, complaint management, lifecycle management, things like that. In their definition, a direct system requires a higher level of quality assurance because it has a much higher potential impact on patient safety and quality. An indirect system has less, so it doesn't need the same level of rigor and documentation as would be required by a direct system. So you started off with, again, does the system impact patient safety or system integrity? And based off of that, you write your intended use. So the FDA actually put forth some examples of documentation for this. So an example intended use they have here. The spreadsheet is intended for use in collecting and graphing non-conformance data stored in a controlled system for monitoring purposes. As such, it's used as part of production or the quality system. But because of this, the spreadsheet is different from similar software used for business operations and accounting. So it has some level of risk. It's involved. It's an indirect system supporting the overall process, but it is not the system of record for the data, right? That's being maintained in a controlled system. So that starts to give you the level of, this is an indirect system. It doesn't directly affect patient safety or system integrity. If you think about this from an eTMF standpoint, I would argue that an eTMF is an indirect system. It doesn't directly drive decisions of clinical significance, quality or system integrity from a patient safety standpoint. It documents things, it maintains the documentation of things, but it is not the EDC system as an example. It's not the stats analysis system. It's not the PV system. So it would fall under the document control mechanism from an indirect system. Therefore, you could argue that it has a lower level of risk. Moving on to the risk assessment side, right? Quoting from the FDA guidance, the risk-based approach entails systematically identifying reasonably foreseeable software failures, right? So that's really important. So what do we see based off of the application that we're using and how it was built? are you reasonably going to see software failures based off of that? What's the risk of failure? And then determine whether that failure, does it pose a high process risk? And then based off of that, determine what your level of assurance needs to be. Right? So again, you determine the areas or functions that could potentially impact product quality and patient safety or system integrity. It's really important to break down your system, right? You may not, whole sections of your system and therefore your features and functions may not have any impact on product quality or patient safety. So therefore you can take a different approach and a more lightweight approach from an assurance standpoint. Another key thing here is, as part of this risk assessment, is to assess the vendor's validation and assurance activities and methodologies. If you can demonstrate and have the documentation to show that they do ongoing release testing, full verification of their system features, and they have that traceability to their requirements and all that kind of stuff, you should accept that into your overall risk assessment as well as into your overall validation documentation. And then you can start to look at it. This is just one example. You don't need to do it this way, but your company should at some point establish an SQA process and methodology, right? But you look at it from the standpoint of a lens of the implementation method being out of the box, configured, or custom against the patient risk, right? So out of the box, we understand you just install the software and it works, right? Configured, you need to add some features, you need to make some changes to that software. But it's not custom development. Custom means you got to build subroutines or other parts of a system in order to make the software work for the business. Those each have different levels of risk. So you can clearly see it would then change the implementation method and the risk levels based off of that. So if you're using an out-of-the-box system that has no patient risk, right, you've got a level 1 kind of implementation method. And it can move on up based off of those kind of factors within that. And again, this can be done on a module by module level if that makes sense for your system. From there, you make a determination on your assurance approach or your testing and validation approach, right? So based off of the risk assessment you just did in the last phase, you determine the kind of testing you're going to do. You can do unscripted, scripted, and a bunch of levels in between that based off the risk rating. So if it's a high risk rating, a 5, right, you would want to do kind of your traditional validation, right? Requirements validated robustly, scripted test scripts, kind of the traditional way we do that. And you move it on down. If it's a level 4, maybe you do a subset of the requirements based off of script testing. If it's a level 3, you start to do things like unscripted testing. So this is where you define, here's the intent of the test, but you don't give people step by step, here's what you need to do in the system. You bring them into the system and you just tell them you need to go log an issue, or you need to upload a document into your eTMF system. And if they can get that done, it means it's met the need. And then on down, right? So level 2, you can do ad hoc testing, which is, kind of spot testing, smoke testing kind of things. Again, less document rigor. And then the final one is you're going to accept the vendor audit and the baseline assurance that was done by the vendor and accept it as is. So do no further testing or verification on your side. Just trace and document to the vendor's documentation and move on, because you have confidence that they've tested this and these features and functions and requirements are being used by a wide variety of clients across the globe. I added some definitions again. I think I went through them, right? Scripted testing it is much more formalized. It has a test objective, step-by-step test procedure, expected results, and then you have to log whether it's pass or fail. Unscripted testing is more open, right? So there's a test objective and you determine whether or not it passes or fails, but there's no step-by-step part of that procedure. And then finally, once you finish all of this work and you've done your assurance, you need to document it appropriately, right? So the quote from the FDA guidance is, when establishing the record, the manufacturer should capture sufficient objective evidence to demonstrate that the software feature, function, or operation was assessed and performs as intended. So the example that came straight out of the appendix of the FDA guidance, right? I already talked through the intended use. It's the same one that we talked about earlier. The risk-based analysis, they state in this particular case, in this case, the software is only used to collect and display data for non-conformances, and the manufacturer has additional process controls and inspections to ensure the non-conforming product is not released. So if the spreadsheet fails, it does not affect product quality in any way. So in that case, they've determined that the software does not pose a high process risk, and the insurance activities would be commensurate with that risk. In this particular case, the testing type that they decided on was unscripted testing. You do some exploratory testing off of that. And the goal of the testing would be to ensure that the analyses can be correctly created, read, updated, and then deleted. So kind of record level assurance. Some final thoughts, and then we can open it up for questions if there are any questions. So again, the key thing to keep in mind with this throughout this process is the risk is based on the impact to patient safety, and then you measure that, if there's a risk to patient safety, against the complexity of their requirements. So it's a two-factor risk assessment on this. Another thing to keep in mind is the FDA has straight out stated the goal of CSA is to take the least burdensome approach to documentation. So they've recognized and acknowledged that validation has turned into a significant documentation effort. Their estimation is that 80% of the effort of validation goes into documentation, and only 20% of the effort goes into actual verification that it does what it's supposed to do. They want to flip that. They want the focus and the energy and the time to go into making sure that it does what it's supposed to do in the areas of high risk. As I said, leveraging your vendor documentation can be a huge advantage, right? And significantly reduce not only your risk, but your documentation requirements from an assurance standpoint. And honestly, the goal of this approach is it should actually result in less defects in production, because you're challenging the system and you're letting the users use the system as they would use it, not just executing step by step scripts, which may or may not actually support the business process that it's intended for. And then finally, before you get into any of these things, you do need to make sure that you either update or create policies and SOPs documenting CSA, and that those SOPs and policies cover, how is your testing conducted, how is your training being done for the system and for assurance testing, and then what is your documentation approach for the overall validation process, and where is it summarized and stored and things like that. So how are you now taking the CSA approach to documentation, as opposed to kind of the traditional validation plan, test summary, validation summary, things like that. I've included in here for when you get this presentation, just some references. So these are the draft guidance on CSA. They did a really nice webinar where they have slides about the draft guidance a couple of years ago. The older general principles of software validation, which are still in place, but are just enhanced by CSA. And I also included EMA guidelines just to make it a little bit balanced, but they support and are in alignment with the FDA guidance on this.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation, Jamie. If you don't mind, stop sharing your slides and I will put mine up there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And there we go. All right. So we do have some time for some Q&A. So I see one here that's gotten several votes. I guess it's a pretty popular question. So do you have any observations on how the inspectors review and call out system validation in place or lack thereof?
So I'm not quite sure. So I'll give an answer, and hopefully this answers it. If not, please jump back in. So inspectors are very focused on system validation. System audits have become a lot more popular over the past several years, to be honest, because I think it's an easy way to poke at sponsors and identify risks. I will say CSA has not been significantly inspected yet. It's still a draft guidance. It's just, well, it's 2 years old now. But my expectation is that it will be, if you follow the methodologies and the processes as outlined by the draft guidance, you won't have a problem with the inspectors. But it is going to, they're going to do the same things that they do today with system level inspections, right? Like they're going to want to know your SOPs, they're going to want to know your processes, and they're going to want to see the documentation has been followed. A big component of CSA and validation that I didn't really cover, because honestly it hasn't changed a whole lot, is, so everything I talked about was getting a system into production. The maintenance and control processes once it's in production really haven't changed. How maybe you do the validation of new features that are introduced would still fall under CSA, but the rest of the systems control processes and change control processes, right? That's a big area that ends up getting poked at by inspectors, because honestly, sponsors aren't very good at maintaining the change controls on systems. So that to me is still a risk area from a systems inspection standpoint, because if it hasn't been done well before, CSA doesn't change that process at all.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. Another question we have here is risk-based validation commonly accepted by sponsors? Usually who takes the lead to implement the risk-based validation? Is it vendors or sponsors?
So in my experience, it is not yet commonly accepted by sponsors, right? As I said earlier, pharma companies are very risk averse, and quality organizations within pharma companies are even more risk averse. In my experience, the people driving a risk-based approach are consulting companies, right? Or the systems integrators, or whoever is implementing the system, to one, get a better outcome, but honestly, to be able to manage the budget and the timeline expectations that the sponsors have. So in the projects that I work on, and my teams work on, right, we spend a lot of time up front working with the quality organizations, honestly, while we're doing requirements and process development, to understand their validation strategy and their desires and things like that. And it's a lot of education recently around CSA, and are they open to that, and will it fit into their SOPs and things like that. From a vendor, if you mean the product vendor side, this is less, this wouldn't affect how a product vendor tests and qualifies their platforms, right? Like their responsibility is still very system requirements focused, right? Does it meet all of the outlined business and functional requirements? That's not going to change, right? And you don't want that to change, because you want to rely on that and leverage that testing capability to reduce the effort that you need to do and the burden on the assurance and validation side.
All right, another question we have is, where can I learn more about the SQA CSA approach?
So definitely the references that I have in the back of my presentation will give you quite a lot of information. The FDA actually has a whole bunch of other documents that I didn't reference into, but they have quite a lot of supplemental Q&As and webinars and things like that. So they actually have quite a lot of information around this. And then certainly if you have other questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. I can do what I can to talk you through things.
Awesome, thank you again. And another question we have is, what is your recommended follow-up for a low risk, not tested, out-of-the-box feature that after implementation is discovered not to function as specified in the software vendor's validation documents?
So you're saying it passed the software vendor's testing, but then it didn't work when you were in your instance. So, I mean, you would definitely want to log a defect and get it remediated. You may want to, I mean, I would honestly recommend at least a query or a supplemental vendor audit, depending on kind of the frequency of that happening. But from a test standpoint, you wait for the release, and maybe you log that as a higher risk now because there's been a failure in the past, and do more robust testing on it just to ensure that it got fixed would be my recommendation on it. But it shouldn't affect the methodology of CSA, because honestly, it's a low risk feature. It shouldn't be stopping your day-to-day operations, and it should have no impact on patient safety.
Thank you. And I think this will be sort of the last question to wrap it up. So data accuracy and standards are important. What's your opinion on that? Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. So data standards are significant, right? I mean, not so much specifically to CSA, but in general, right? The more consistency you have in data within a system, the less likely that the data is going to cause errors, right? Like, and there's kind of a difference, right? Like, you can have a system that works perfectly, an application that works perfectly, and your data doesn't meet the specifications required by that system, right? So that's a defect. Technically, the system isn't doing what you're doing. It may very well affect patient safety, but it's no longer an application problem. It's a data problem. Any system that I have that has a significant amount of data, my recommendation is to establish standards where possible, to leverage standards that are industry standards where possible, and to build a data governance framework and a data quality framework to ensure that information, one, is clean and accurate when the system goes live, but also is continued to be maintained in a clean and accurate standpoint, right? The biggest problem, most of the time, it gets clean to go live because there's all this testing going on. But then day 2, after the system goes live, people start putting stuff in that isn't appropriate or isn't appropriately governed. You think about CTMS and eTMF systems, they put an investigator in, they don't bother looking to see if the investigator already exists, they just add another one in, and now all of a sudden, your reports about fraud for an investigator don't work because it's the same investigator, but in the system it's 2.
All right, thank you so much, Jamie. If we didn't get to your question, Jamie will be available after to maybe answer any questions you have in the lounge, maybe answer them here, so you can reach out to him if you have any outstanding questions that he wasn't able to get to. And thank you so much again for the presentation. It was super insightful. I'm just going to finish up now with some final housekeeping, if you will. So tomorrow is our day 4, the final day of TMF week, and it is a customer focus day, but you are all welcome to attend. You're going to be able to see sort of Montrium's vision and our upcoming roadmap, as well as kind of poke around in the system a little bit, see about implementing a risk-based QC workflow, and some training related topics. So it should be super interesting. I hope to see you all there tomorrow. And finally, now you can go and network. You can go to the lounge or the Montrium booth, chat with some other booth members on a range of subjects. You can meet some new people, just chill, have a good time. And before you go, I do have to ask one final time, if you haven't already, we would love if you could go and take our TMF Pulse Check survey. Enters you in for a chance to win a super cool pair of I Heart TMF Converse shoes. So if you haven't done it already, it's super quick. It takes 6 minutes, and we'd really love to have your opinion. And with that, thank you so much for your session, Jamie. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and I hope to see you all tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.